Hi, I'm indie fantasy author Melinda Kucsera, and in this episode of Fantasy Lore and More, Geneva Price is joining me to talk about her book, The Guildmaster's Daughter. So, welcome, Geneva, and let's talk about The Guildmaster's Daughter.
Thank you, Melinda. I am really happy to be here today. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.
Um, yeah, so where should I start telling you about the Guildmaster's Daughter?
Well,
You
let's
know,
talk about the title. Why is it called The Guildmaster's Daughter? What's going on with her?
okay, so it's actually an interesting sort of play. I mean, she is the Guildmaster's daughter, but so the story is about an artistically gifted young woman in 1816 New York City. So it's got that Regency era vibe with those manners and kind of language and all the things that we kind of love about that Austen world. But she is confronted a little bit more than many of those sort of Regency heroines. With the restrictions of society. I mean, they're all supposed to get married and, can we inherit and do we have to marry? And I mean, obviously society drives other Regency plots, but in this one, she is an artistically gifted young woman who doesn't particularly want to get married, but she has this stepfather who is very, very patriarchal. And with the combination of him and society together, she is very constrained. And so, but she, like any of us, I think, she wants the love and approval, especially of this stepfather who, she obviously doesn't have her real father. She never knew him. And so she wants, this man's love and approval. And so she is really at the very beginning caught between wanting to please this man and earn his approval, if not his love. And also, feeling the pressures of society of she has this great gift, but even though he himself is a famous artist, she is discouraged from pursuing it. We all know that Regency period people, the women in particular, were supposed to, have all of these wonderful talents, supposed to read and embroider and do all these other things, but not to an extent where you would challenge the men who worked in any of those things as a profession, right?
Yeah.
So you were encouraged to be able to draw, but not so well that you could take it up as a profession or show up a man who was an artist. And so she holds her tongue and she hides her drawings and tries to be the good girl that she is until one day he inadvertently reveals to her the existence of this magic ink that turns the imaginary into things that are real. And in so doing, he's forced to reveal to her that he is actually, that there is a guild that protects this ink and that he is the guild master who controls it. And so much of the story is concerned with her wanting to assert this, her destiny, her passion to pursue her talents, including the ability to use this ink, um, against the anonymity, which is why she's referred to as the Guildmaster's daughter, is she doesn't really have an identity other than so-and-so's daughter, or whatever role she plays in society. So long answer to why the Guildmaster's daughter is obviously, I mean, he is the Guildmaster that controls this ink, but it is a play on the anonymity that she's sort of struggling against and her desire to sort of make her place. So,
Oh, wow. That's so wow. So that's quite a lot going on there. So there's this magic ink.
yes. So
I
we
want to
have
hear
this
more about
magical
that.
ink. Yeah, so the original inspiration for on the author side, the original inspiration for the ink was a children's book called Harold and the Purple Crayon, where this kid draws his world with a purple crayon, which, as you can tell from my purple hair, that I very much approve of his crayon choice. But he navigates through this world that he's drawing, and then has to find his way home through the world that he's drawn. So he draws a dragon and scares himself and falls into some water and draws himself a boat to rescue himself. And this really clever little story with a wonderful little pun at the end. And it was a story that I used to read to even my older kids when I used to teach art. And so the idea originally came from there, but then pile on all of the other things where you've got Mary Poppins, the chalk pavement pictures where they disappear into the pictures and go riding on the carousel.
I love
Or
that.
the paintings in Night at the Museum, right? Where they're doing that chase scene. I think it's the second movie where they pop into the paintings and interact with the paintings and then pop back out. So imagine that kind of thing is how this ink works. And that's sort of the author side inspiration. On the book side, though, the ink itself, it was intermittently present throughout history, but at least in the parameters of this story, the ink was discovered by Leonardo da Vinci, one of the greatest imaginations alive.
Mhm.
There is a story in one of his journals where he was hiking and came across a cave and was sort of both consumed with curiosity and terror simultaneously at the entrance of this cave, wondering what was inside. And so I kind of took from that when he entered this cave, this is where he discovered the ink, is that this overwhelm of emotion and imagination that he had standing outside of this mysterious blank space. When he walked inside, there was sort of a consolidation of all imagination to a point that it was liquid. So kind of like water vapor condensing into dew. And so he took a sample of it, and that's where the ink originated, and they've sort of been passing it down. It never exhausts because there is no way to exhaust imagination. So they keep the artist guild. So he created the guild that protects it because, you can imagine that if people are given the power to allow imagination to become real, that some people might not put it to good use. And that the things that live in our imaginations aren't always benign. And
Oh.
so he creates the guild to protect both, the consumer side and to regulate who is allowed to use it, sort of for everyone's safety. And so that's the sort of the backstory history that leads down to this particular guild master controlling the ink. And he has a personal bid for power, but anyway, that's where the ink originated, both on my side and then story side. And it just really opens up a portal for this young woman where she can experience a degree of control that she would never, ever have in reality. And she
That
wants that. I mean, who wouldn't,
yeah.
right?
That's true. Like, that's so cool. That's just the camera keeps, like, moving. I'm like, "I didn't touch anything. Why did it move?"
It's like you
That
got
was
a cat
so
back there playing with something.
I don't. We're not allowed to have pets. Like, I'm like, "Wait, why did it move?" I just breathed. All right, fictional characters are on the prowl today on the
Right?
podcast. But that is so maybe somebody used the ink to draw the camera, and
There you go. Exactly. Yeah,
that's
they're
why it's not
manipulating it.
behaving.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So this is, it's a fun thing to think about. Like, if
Yeah,
you had this ink, which is entirely governed not so much by artistic talent. I mean, really, that's just an angle to get into it.
right,
It's the idea of it is the belief in possibility, right? So if you
right.
can believe it, if you can conceive it and believe in it, you can create it with the ink. So it's just a fun thing to think about. Like, you personally, as a fantasy writer,
Yeah,
God, if your world is like, you could actually step into the worlds that you create, not just as we do typically as readers, right? And that is an element of being in the world that this ink creates. In the story, there's a world that I called Fantasia, not to piggyback off of Disney, but with the PH, which is the Greek word. Fantasia is the Greek word for the ability of an artist, either a writer or a visual artist or a musician, to recreate in the mind of somebody else an experience that they're having.
Oh, wow.
Which is exactly what this is doing. Um, and, we get there, if we're going to talk about Fantasia as though it's a real place and not just in my book, we get there, we experience it whenever we get lost in doing artwork or get lost in reading a story. But if you had this ink, you
Yeah.
could actually go in and touch, smell, feel, interact, and manipulate that world directly, as opposed to just sort of viewing it, spectating it.
That's so cool. Like, so if you drew, like, I don't know, a dragon or something, would the dragon then, like, actually live and breathe and have its own, be independent of you and make its own decisions? Or would it, like, how does that work if you draw something that's supposed to be sentient?
That's actually a beautiful question, and kind of they get to it a little bit later in the book because, of
Sure.
course, Faith, the main character, as she's learning to use the ink, she does create some stuff, and there is it's actually a very important question in the book is, what does it mean to be a god, right?
Yeah.
Um, if you're going to create sentient beings, how do you embody in that the element of free choice when it's something that's coming out of your own imagination? Right? So,
Yeah.
does it do things that it does because it's what you want it to do? And then how do you feel about that? Is it actually possible to play that role? Now, of course, she does draw several things, and on the cover, there's sort of a sea serpent, maybe a mermaid-ish. There's something fishy with scales and a fin, and that is one of the things that she creates very early in the story, without even knowing, the kind of power that her imagination might have, because she hasn't even encountered the ink yet. But if you create something, it sort of has to operate off of what you put into it, right? You can't separate yourself from yourself.
No.
So whatever you create may be embodied with your fears or your hopes or what you want of it. And that is the perfect question. But yeah, these things, whatever you draw with it, would come to life, and you can definitely interact with it. So
That's so neat. That's
yeah,
so cool. Do you want to see anything else about it? I feel like we should go to the excerpt right now. We're like,
yeah, actually, we could go to the excerpt, and actually, you'll see a little bit of this in action even early on. Like I said, she hasn't been told about the ink yet,
right.
but her imagination is so powerful that you get a little taste of kind of how this would work.
So the
So.
ink finds her. Would
Sort
that
of,
be?
yeah. I mean, you could really say that this is very much her destiny, which is why all of the societal restrictions and her stepfather wanting to sort of thwart both her talent and her threat to his superiority within the guild. Why she's really constrained by that, because this is her calling. So. Um,
Yeah. It sounds like he would be afraid if he's, if power is something that he craves and she's, yeah. All right, let's go to the excerpt. I want to meet her,
okay.
and I guess in him, I guess we're going to hear him as well in this excerpt.
Yeah, I'm gonna, as we sort of discussed before, I'm gonna go a little bit longer just so that you get a piece
Sure.
of her, of him, and then kind of a little bit of the flavor of how the ink works a little bit. Okay, so here we go. I have one other thing is I have quotes above the chapter headings. I'm going to skip those just for continuity right now, little epigraphs, but they're quotes from books that would have been in common circulation at the time that she would have been familiar with.
And
Moralistic teachings and things.
right. So this is so she's living in I guess England.
So yeah, so Faith is English born. She's British born. So the stepfather is actually, so one of the things I should know before I dive into this is that when you're writing historical fiction, every author, of course, has to make a decision: is how realistic to history are you going to be? Are you, like when you watch, something like the Patriot Games, they don't actually put a real president in. They make up a president,
Right, right.
President Smith or whatever, because, issues. But when you're going backwards in history, you kind of have a choice, right? Do you just make up everybody? Do you make some real? How much do you adhere? Do you change like dates and things? I made a conscious decision, with the exception of Faith as a fictional character, and I'll leave it to you as to whether the guild is fictional or not. All the other players in this are actual historical figures, and I adhered as closely as possible to real dates, times, events, and tried to find a way to make the fictional elements fit with what was going on in history. So if you read a history book, you could like put these things in the gaps and it would still read almost truthfully. I don't know. That's kind of maybe going overboard, but
That's
so I made a
cool.
conscious decision to do that. So any of the characters in here, other than Faith, like the painting that I'm talking about is a real one that you can go Google. These are real people. However, there is one major caveat here, is that obviously we cannot know any of these people's real motivations or anything like that. So the stepfather in this one, the guild master, is based on Revolutionary War hero John Trumbull, who most people in the Northeast will be familiar, at least driving on roads, especially if you're in Connecticut. Founding family of the colonies and everything. But anyway, he is my guild master here because he was the preeminent artist. But I have attributed to him, sort of an amalgamation of all of the different attitudes of society, and then exaggerated some for, because somebody had to be the villain. So this is
Right.
not necessarily real John Trumbull. It's his place in society, but you cannot ascribe any of this to him as a real person. So I just want to make that long disclaimer because it is sort of important to distinguish between the desire to be historically accurate in a broad sense and that the characters themselves are totally fictionalized. So,
So they shouldn't
okay.
come after you if they're descendants of the
Well,
real.
no, and just like, everything, well, it seems disingenuous, right? You read you watch a historical fiction and then it says, nothing here is based on historical anything, and it's all a coincidence. And you're like, but this is a historical piece, right? So this is that disclaimer, but a little bit more realistically. This is a historical piece with real characters in it, but everything about them internally is fictionalized. So that would have been the short way to go about it. So if you edit
I
this
like
down, you can just jump right to that part.
No, I like the long I like the long description. I think it's important to hear how you came to this and why and what your decisions were. I think that's really important. So I'm not cutting anything.
Okay, well, I just felt like I was
I'm
sort of rambling a bit, but it is important. It was a very important thought process for me while writing it. Okay,
No,
so
and it's
before,
important and that's why I feel like it's important to leave that in. It wasn't a ramble for me. I don't write historical fiction, so I found that like fascinating.
okay, cool. I'm glad I brought something to it. All right.
Yeah, it's not
Um,
something I've ever had to think about. Okay, let's get to the excerpt. I'm going to mute myself so I don't interfere.
okay, all right, let's get going. All right, chapter 1 of The Guildmaster's Daughter, The Voyage. Faith was lost in a world of pure imagination. In her mind, she flew into a bonfire sunset that trailed to blue-purple dusk in her wake. Her body pulsed with the rhythmic beat of wings until they went still and soared effortlessly over deep, dark water. The sun drew Faith westward toward a strange new world that cast long, dark shadows before it. The great bird on which Faith rode banked and circled lazily on a column of air. Tilting over the flat expanse of ocean far below, Faith tightened her grip on the smooth leather harness and flattened herself against the scarlet feathers. She urged the phoenix on with her knees and her thoughts, faster, higher. Ginger hair whipped across her face. She felt no fear of heights, only the sweet exhilaration of freedom and power. Faith's only fear was the ocean. This high up, it was rendered a featureless plain, but she sensed something primal and uncontrollable in its depths. Something there haunted her. She could feel it tracking her arc across the sky, waiting for the moment she would dip too low. Then it would strike. The phoenix she rode cried out defiantly. Faith! Faith started at the sound of her name, so loud and near to her ear. Reality greeted her with a jolt. She was not soaring through the sky on a majestic firebird. Instead, she rode the roll and pitch of the Illinois, perched atop a storage locker with her back against the quarter-deck wall. Instead of riding breeches, she wore a high-waisted dress with a fitted bodice and full skirt under a coat that pulled uncomfortably across her shoulders. Her hair was a tight knot beneath her bonnet, the only loose part of it the fugitive tendrils torn free by the wind. The only leather in her hands was the soft-covered sketchbook she had been drawing in. Her stepfather stood in front of her with an impatient expression. Yes, Colonel, she said, quickly sitting upright. I've been calling you, he scowled at her. It was hard to hear anything over the sound of the water, wind, creak of the ship, snapping sails, and the calls of seabirds, but Faith knew he would not appreciate excuses. I'm sorry, Colonel, Faith said, lowering her eyes. This drew the Colonel's attention to the sketchbook on her lap, and his scowl deepened. The corner of her drawing curled and danced as though clamoring for attention. Too late, Faith snapped the book shut. What have you been sketching? The Colonel asked, holding out his hand. Faith's stomach nodded, but she obediently handed the book to him. He held it open at arm's length, closing and reopening his left eye. A bird, he pronounced when he had succeeded in focusing. Nothing like any seabird I've seen. In fact, there could be no bird like this. The tail is far too long and elaborate to allow for flight under any conditions. Preposterous, really, and the lines here are weak, he said, tapping his finger on an outstretched wing and smudging the graphite. You must make a more careful study of reality. You will have better results than indulging wild flights of fancy. Faith looked away and bit the inside of her cheek. She knew she was not a master artist like he, but she had thought the drawing a good one. Shame heated her already wind-burned cheeks, and she scolded herself for her vanity. Thank you, Colonel. I will try to do better. The Colonel nodded, his expression easing. That is all we can do. He paged backwards in her book, squinting at other drawings until he came to one that made him stop. His brows climbed and his thin lips compressed to almost nothing. Sirens! What is in your head, Faith Trumbull? Vulgar and disgraceful. Faith winced as he tore the offending page from her sketchbook as though he had torn it from her own body. He crumpled the paper in his fist and stepped to the railing to throw it over. The bent and creased siren spiraled in an eddy of wind before dropping out of sight. For a heartbeat, Faith thought he might throw the whole sketchbook over. Her eyes pricked with tears, but she bit down against the protest that rose in her throat. When the Colonel turned back to her, he still held her book in his hand, but Faith would not breathe easier until it was back in hers. On a voyage of this length, it is unavoidable that you've been exposed to sailor stories, but an educated lady as yourself should recognize them for the ignorant superstitions that they are. A loud bang interrupted the Colonel. As he turned with a glare, Faith snuck a glance at the sailors near them on the deck. Eyes on their work, none gave obvious offense. Still, the Colonel continued more quietly. They should be dismissed as one with the rantings of the fevered, not multiplied with graphic illustration. In truth, Faith was enthralled with the marvelous tales the sailors told of strange events and stranger creatures. Hearing about krakens and kelpies had certainly done nothing to alleviate her fear of the sea. She could hardly venture closer than 2 paces to the railing, but she had been spellbound nonetheless. Their world was one of adventure and mystery, danger and beauty, altogether unlike her ordered and predictable one. Even if their stories had been less thrilling, after more than a month on board, they were nearly the only distraction left to her. She was bored and wicked. Yes, Colonel, she said, acknowledging his rebuke. Afraid to meet his eyes, she spoke to the buttons of his coat. I admit that I have paid more heed than I should have, but only for want of other occupations. I've read all of the books we brought, some of them more than twice. There's no more embroidery to be done without more thread. Besides, I didn't think their stories so different from the classics or the poets. With morbid fascination, Faith had read the Rime of the Ancient Mariner at least a dozen times with hardly a cross look from the Colonel. Why is the one acceptable to illustrate and the other not? All art, indeed all thought, should be devoted to that which instructs in virtue and uplifts the spirit. Some myths and poetry are worthy to this task. Sordid and salacious tales of lustful waterborne demons, however, are not. Understanding this distinction is why these things are the province of men, particularly the masters among them. Ladies should confine themselves to fruits and flowers and the occasional modest portrait. Yes, Colonel, I will remember that, Faith answered. Although where she would find fruits or flowers at sea was beyond her, she had traded a drawing to the captain's cook for the last mealy apple several days ago. As for portraits, she had drawn nearly every face on board, but she wondered how modest he would find some of the sailors' countenances. To her, they were pirates and explorers, star-crossed lovers and tragic heroes, Byronic privateers and ancient mariners. She'd even drawn an albatross around the neck of a grizzled old sailor who looked the part. Faith eyed the sketchbook in the Colonel's hand, the knot in her stomach tightening at the thought of him looking through it further. Good, he said. I suppose it to be expected. Idle hands were ever the devil's tools, he said in a consoling tone, apparently appeased. Consequently, you will be especially glad to hear what I came to tell you. I have spoken with Captain Noyes, and it seems we have reached Montauk. We should be in port within a day, overmorrow at the most. Oh, that's wonderful news. A wave of joy to match the swells beneath the hull lifted Faith's spirits. When they had first sighted land, she had known there would soon be an end to the tedious boredom, turning food, and terrible smells. The excitement had faded as the far-off shoreline slipped by day after day, never closer. With this news, though, Faith could dare to believe the ordeal was near its end. She would have a proper bath and put on a fresh dress and feel truly clean for the first time in many weeks. More appealing than anything was the prospect of solid ground beneath her feet. Go below and tell your mother. I am certain she will be relieved as well, perhaps enough to join us for dinner. As for this, he said, holding up her sketchbook, I will hold it for now. I suggest these last hours be spent in prayerful contemplation. There is one book you should never tire of reading. Yes, Colonel, Faith said, biting again at the inside of her cheek. He responded with a curt nod that was as much approval as dismissal. He turned up the quarterdeck stairs, stride crisp and bearing upright in spite of the tilting deck. Faith watched him for a moment. Even in his early 60s, Colonel John Trumbull was a formidable man. His hair was gray but full, his features still sharp and distinguished. He carried himself with self-assurance and a noble bearing befitting his politic and artistic fame. Revolutionary War hero, political prisoner, diplomat, internationally renowned artist, he counted presidents and statesmen among his regular correspondents. He filled many important roles, but doting father was not among them. Faith often wondered what her real father had been like. Her mother refused to speak of him. Whether out of pain of loss or respect for the colonel, Faith did not know. Would he have been as handsome and well respected? Would he have been more loving and less reserved? Would he have praised her simple drawings and let her call him father or even papa like the other girls did? She sighed and turned her gaze to the horizon. The sky had been strangely hazy since early summer, as though a gauzy veil had been drawn over the firmament, but the sunsets were dazzling. The sun was now a golden puddle beneath an explosion of carmine, vermilion, and magenta. A seagull flew past, its silhouette consumed by the bright center of the sinking sun before re-emerging as a dark chevron on a flaming sky, like a phoenix in fire. Faith sighed again and shook her head, ridding it of unproductive thoughts. Wondering how her life might have been different was as useful as daydreaming about mythical birds, and utterly ungrateful. A man of the colonel's stature must maintain his dignity, both in his affections and in those who shared his name. She supposed it was a mark of his esteem that he expected so much of her, and gave so little praise for it. Faith reminded herself that she was fortunate and should be proud to consider a man like him her father. If she worked harder to school her wild and wicked heart, and if he didn't look too carefully at her sketchbook, she was sure she could one day make him proud in return. With fresh resolve and the happy prospect of an end to their voyage, Faith made her unsteady way to the stairs, grabbing in turn onto each rope, stanchion, and box that lined her path. The ocean had grown more fitful as the afternoon passed, and she could not rid herself of the image of losing her balance and tumbling overboard. At the top of the steps, she paused and took one last gulp of fresh air before heading below deck. She held her breath while her eyes adjusted to the sudden darkness. Sadly, there was no adjusting to the smell that rose up from the tween-deck hatch down to steerage. It had not been long after they set sail before unwashed bodies, mildewed bedding, human waste, and sickness had formed a noxious miasma that was no match for the meager air from a few portholes. The fumes rose up through the hatch like a creature trying to escape its own stench. Of course, the colonel would never have demeaned himself to travel in such conditions and had secured them a room. Faith walked as quickly as decorum allowed down the common space between the staterooms, not daring to draw breath again until she was at her own cabin door. She stepped into the cramped room and wrinkled her nose. It did not smell good in the cabin either. Her mother had suffered seasickness the whole voyage, and the bedding was musty with constant damp. But the porthole was open, moving the stale smell of vomit and mold, and compared to the stench from steerage, it was tolerable. Her mother raised her head as the door scraped shut, then fell again when she saw it was Faith. Good news, Mamma. The colonel says we will reach port in a day or two. Her mother groaned. Bloody hell, child, must you shout so? Her Scots-tinged English accent was raspy with sleep. Her mother turned on her side and covered her head with a pillow. Her next words came out muffled. I don't know why you're so excited. There are as many sharks in New York as there are in the water. We'd find a warmer welcome at the bottom of the sea. The idea made Faith shiver, though she did share some of her mother's worry about what waited for them on shore. Faith was, like her mother, born in England, hardly an endearing trait to the Americans following 2 wars now. It did not help that her mother, an orphan raised far from high society, lacked the refined manners that were so valued on both sides of the Atlantic. Her accent and her language were coarse. Her efforts to imitate the graceful courtesies were forced and exaggerated. It was a trait that vexed the colonel in private, but he never failed to defend in public. They had gone to America once before when Faith was very little. At the outset, their ship had been caught in a terrible gale, and the reception by the colonel's family had not been gentler. When her mother was tipsy, she would start to complain of some unforgivable incident, but the colonel would not tolerate the topic. Faith could not specifically recall the ship's dangerous passage, nor any part of the incident, but both had left a mark in her mind. Whatever had happened, the colonel had severed most of his family connections, and they'd hardly had a letter since. Fortunately, though, none of his family lived in New York, and visitors were unlikely. There was little to dim Faith's excitement about leaving the ship beyond her mother's melancholy. Still, she did speak more quietly. "Will you come to dinner at least?" Faith asked as she went to the small dresser secured to the wall. She poured water from the pitcher into its chipped basin, careful not to splash lest the colonel scold her for being sloppy. In the black splotched mirror, she watched her mother rise up on one elbow to consider Faith's request. Usually a great beauty, Sarah Trumble's face was gaunt and pale with dark rings beneath her eyes. "You might feel better if you eat." "No, I will stay abed," Sarah said, sinking back down. Faith found herself frowning as she directed her attention to her own reflection. She removed her bonnet to find a sunburnt nose and chin and a frizzy halo about her head. She splashed some water on her face and used wet fingers to coax the curls back into place. She was only partly successful, but it would have to do. Having washed off the salt air and neatened herself as well as she could, she turned back to her mother. "Can I bring you something at least?" "Wine, dear. Bring me some wine. It settles my nerves." "Yes, Mamma," Faith said, as she slipped quietly out the cabin door. All right, let me take a drink. Chapter 2. Chapter 2, The Last Campaign. The colonel lingered in the common area for a while after dinner, but soon excused himself to pace the deck. The night was unusually balmy, with a strong wind driving broad bands of clouds across the sky. The waning gibbous moon gave them a silver aura and made the white-capped waves glow. Squinting, the colonel could make out the black silhouette of land. He regarded it with both eagerness and apprehension, as though on the eve of battle. He had only ever wanted one thing in life, a legacy. From the time he had learned of Phidias and Praxiteles, Zeuxis and Apelles, names celebrated for their art more than 2,000 years after their deaths, he too had dreamt of such immortal fame. He had been certain and determined that he too would create such works of enduring art that his name would live on, remembered long after those associated with the baser affairs of war and politics had been lost to the tides of history. A rueful smile turned the corner of his lips as he remembered the look on his father's face when he had asked to study under Mr. Copley, rather than take the place his father had procured for him at Harvard. "This isn't Athens," his father had said. Hindsight turned the colonel's smile into a frown. His father had been too right. It had not been until after the First War that an introduction by Dr. Franklin had connected him with Benjamin West, the gifted American expatriate who had risen to become royal painter to the British king. It was from West that he had learned what it truly meant to have talent. From the moment he had learned of the guild, it was no longer enough to be considered a master by common men. After all, what was the approbation of the blind and uncultured compared to those who knew the real power of the pencil? From that day, he had determined to become a guild master himself, a legend among legends. 30 years later, he had thought his dues overpaid. He had thought it was his time. The colonel had sailed to England with two purposes. One, to benefit from the eminent physicians, who, he had been assured, could both alleviate the pain and further deterioration of his ever-useless left eye, and stop the spread of its affliction to the right. The greater mission had been to visit Guildmaster West and secure his endorsement for the foundation of an American guild with himself at its head. He had failed at both purposes. The deck rocked sharply, forcing the colonel to steady himself at the rail. He held it white-knuckled as he remembered the interview with Mr. West. The colonel had been received in Mr. West's studio, where he was at work on an enormous canvas. Mr. West had been refining the musculature of a pale horse at the center of a tumultuous scene. The colonel had delivered his proposal to the man's back, the motion of Guildmaster West's brush the only clue to his thoughts. When the colonel had finished, there had been a silence as the brush moved undisturbed from palette to canvas. "Will you endorse my bid?" the colonel had asked. The brush wavered ever so slightly. "No." "That is your answer? How can you object to an American guild? Surely you recognize that we are no longer the artistic wasteland you left so long ago. The constant stream of American talent which has come to you here and the strength of the product is enough to demonstrate that we merit a chapter of our own." "I do recognize the American talent. I have had the pleasure of initiating a great many of them and seeing them rise to the level of master. Yourself included." His tone had been infuriatingly mild, patronizing. "Then you must realize how dangerous it is that with the difficulty of travel and inconstant politics, so many of them never complete the training. There are far more journeymen and fewer masters than there should be. Some could even be considered rogues." Mr. West had not answered him. The colonel had grown heated at West's apparent indifference to this threat. "Or is the problem that you are an old man desperately clinging to his former glory, unwilling to pass the torch to a worthy heir?" This time the brush stopped. Mr. West laid it on the edge of his palette and turned to face the colonel. He regarded the colonel for several moments with a somber expression before speaking. "John, after all these years, do you think so ill of me?" I do not oppose the formation of an American guild. In fact, I think it is long overdue. Then it is me whom you find objectionable. I have reservations on 2 counts. I have already been approached by Mr. Vanderlyn seeking the same position. Vanderlyn, stop your jest. I'll grant he has talent enough, but that upstart lacks any notion of the classical ideals, the sacred traditions that the guild is duty-bound to protect. Just look at his body of work. My work and the esteem in which it is held speaks for me. Perhaps, but consider that the American Academy commissioned Vanderlyn to expand its collection. He had their confidence. The Academy is run by doctors and merchants. They know nothing about art and certainly not the guild. Besides, he did nothing with the opportunity. We both know that is because they became insolvent. You were its most recent vice president. What have you done with the position? Mr. West did not pause to let the colonel answer. My point is that Vanderlyn would not have received the commission if he were not highly regarded by your brethren, and his work is popular with the educated layman. The High Council will consider that a referendum on his fitness for the honor of guildmaster as much as for you. I will also tell you this, and hope you will take the breach of confidence as a sign of my esteem for you. Vanderlyn has plans to establish his own art academy and to house the American Guild within that. That is why he sought me out. And you have endorsed him? Mr. West shrugged. John, I've lived in England for so long and owe so much of my career to her, I can no longer consider myself an American. If a new chapter is to be founded, it must be at the discretion of those who will be governed by it. It is not my place to nominate or endorse. As a member of the High Council, I will only vote what is before me. The colonel nodded, crossing his arms over his chest. What is your second reservation, then? You will not like it, but I urge you to consider it. Perhaps Vanderlyn is the better candidate. The colonel sputtered in indignation, but Mr. West held up a hand. You or I are old, John. Neither of us is as skilled as we once were. As we age, our vision dims. You are blaming this on my eyesight. I'll remind you that I have never had good use of my left eye and earned my mastery with ease. Mr. West shook his head. I meant our imaginations as much as our eyesight. Look at this painting. Do you think it is good or better than my older ones? He gestured to a tall, narrow painting leaning in the corner. A woman surrounded by divine light with a dragon at her heels was being lifted by angels toward heaven. It was inspired work. Do your recent works compare favorably to your past? Since your return, what has been the demand for your art? Negligible, but that is entirely explained by the tensions between our countries. Even with an English wife and child and a son in the British Army, it is apparently too much for a prominent American painter such as myself to ask for British patronage. Are you sure that is the reason? I wonder if your countrymen, who are also in England, now face the same obstacle. Mr. West waved away his incendiary question. That is of no matter. Perhaps you are right. Maybe I am reluctant to give up the helm. Maybe it is vanity, or maybe I, like you, am protective of those ideals you mentioned. But you and I must both consider that those ideals have changed over the centuries. Perhaps it is time to let the new talent take over while we gracefully fade into obscurity. I have no intention of fading away, gracefully or otherwise. I assure you I am in my prime, and I will achieve my purpose with or without you. Know that I consider your lack of support a grave offense. I bid you good day, sir, the colonel had said, turning on his heel to leave. It had been the colonel's intention to leave England as abruptly as he had left West's studio, but the outbreak of the Second War had trapped him there before he could wrap up his affairs. Now, 7 years later, he was finally ending his last, and he was certain it was his last, dismal sojourn in England with nothing to show for it but a mountain of debt. As it was, the stateroom below his feet represented nearly the last of his dwindling credit. This voyage, one final desperate campaign. If he did not succeed now, when? The thought of lost time propelled the colonel away from the ship's railing to pace the deck once again, heels knocking loudly on the planks. He clasped a fist behind his back, remembering how many times capricious fate had turned him aside in pursuit of his life's goals. Wars, illness, duty, both moral and to his country. Betrayal. With his connections and a few carefully worded letters, he had derailed Vanderlyn's ambitions and bought himself a little time. But he could not afford to be turned aside again. And yet all of those past hindrances paled in comparison to the one that loomed before him tonight. What he had seen in Faith's sketchbook had shaken him to the core. Even with his impaired insight, he could see the genius in her work. For pencil drawings in a pocket-sized sketchbook done on the rolling deck of a ship in a strong swell, they were nothing short of incredible. The compositions were well balanced, the lines sure and elegant. Undoubtedly, the exposure to his own skill had contributed to hers, but it was far more than that. He could see the movement of the ocean and hear the call of the sirens. He had seen the unmistakable shimmer of inspiration. When he had warned Guildmaster West of rogues, he had never thought to find one in his own household. Such innate talent was rarely seen, and never in a woman. It was a perversion, a crime against nature. Her very existence had already cost him much. To think that some ill-begotten fetch from an utterly visionless woman could threaten to undermine the colonel's overdue legacy, or worse, threaten to expose the power that the guild had long safeguarded, was too much to be borne. But what was he to do about it? As a matter of strict propriety, he should notify his guildmaster. until an American guild had been established. However, that was Mr. West. The colonel refused to entertain the thought. Of course, once an American guild had been established, the colonel would, God willing, be the master of it, and the dilemma she posed would be entirely at his discretion. He would have to keep her talent suppressed until then. And after, she could not possibly be trained within the guild. Woman had no place there. Yet he could not dismiss her either. Ignorant and unchecked, she would be dangerous. The colonel stopped, grasping a stay that twitched in a fierce gust of wind. Lost in thought, he barely noticed the flapping of his coattails or the spatter of rain on his face. Faith was the fulcrum, he realized, the point about which his fortunes pivoted. Allowed to develop her talent, she would be his ruin, but put to good use, she could be an asset. She and her abilities would need to be carefully controlled. Evening, Mr. Trumbull. Was it you wearing a hole in my deck a moment ago? Captain Noyes startled the colonel out of his thoughts. Yes, Captain, but it's Colonel, if you please. The colonel's hand went instinctively to the hilt of his Hessian sword, only to remember he had left it on the dresser, along with the Bible and Faith's sketchbook. My apologies for your deck, but I have many pressing affairs waiting for me in New York, and I am eager to dock. Me too, the captain said, looking at the sails in the sky. The colonel noticed that he could no longer see the shore nor the moon. The sky was thick with scudding cloud. Storm coming, hoping we can land ahead of it. Indeed, the colonel replied. All right, chapter 3. This is where the great gale. And this will be where we stop. The thickness of the hull that surrounded Faith below deck was only a trifle more reassuring than the railing above. She had no fear of washing overboard, but she was acutely aware of the sea pressing in on all sides. When they had sailed in its gently cupped palm, Faith's anxiety was an ever-present but manageable knot in the back of her mind. Tonight, however, they were squeezed by a querulous fist. Cradle-like lulls were punctuated by dramatic rises and falls, creaks and moans that made Faith's heart pound and pushed all sensible thoughts from her mind. One angry spasm too many, and the ship would surely splinter. Between her nervousness about both the colonel's and the ocean's temper, and her excitement that she would soon be beyond at least the ocean's grasp, Faith had hardly been able to eat. Now her stomach twisted around the bits of biscuit, stringy vegetables, and stale water that she had managed. An answering groan from without conjured a vivid image of their ship tumbling within the belly of an enormous beast. Faith squeezed her eyes shut against the vision and shrank deeper into the niche that was her bunk. As the swell subsided, she opened her eyes and scanned the walls for signs of leaks. Finding none, her gaze fell on the bed. Her mother snored undisturbed, the empty carafe of wine sliding on the railed table beside her. The colonel had not yet retired. In need of distraction, Faith had resolutely followed his advice and reached for the worn leather Bible, ignoring her sketchbook which the colonel had left next to it with his sword. The Bible lay heavy in her lap atop the blanket that was pulled up under her arms. Faith opened it to the page marked by its ribbon and found herself in the book of Job. Having no particular purpose, she began where the colonel had left off. She read with fleeting attention about the righteous man from whom God had stripped everything as a test of faith. The print was cramped and hard to read in the oscillating light of the swaying oil lamp. Her eyes followed the words as best they could until, realizing her mind had not followed the argument, she would go back a few verses and start again. As Job argued with his friends about the nature of a God who would torment a subject so, Faith marked only the occasional philosophy or curious image. It was not until God himself answered Job, speaking from out of the whirlwind, that the words and images ensnared her imagination. She leaned over the book, her shadow darkening the page, as visions of God stopping up the sea with bars and doors and draping it in a garment of cloud and darkness formed in her head. What would it be like to command the rain in the path of lightning, to order the stars themselves and to make them sing? How was it to fashion a world of your own design and to populate it? To craft the horse and the hawk, imbuing each with its beauty and virtue, or to devise on a whim something new and exquisite and wholly unknown to man? And then she read of Leviathan. She saw it as though it swam in the air before her, its infinite coils trailing a shining wake in the sea of her mind. Flames shot from its mouth as smoke poured from its nostrils and curled before its glowing eyes. Its teeth were a murderous portcullis raised above the gate of a black and sulphurous void. An unrestrainable beast of the sea with a heart as hard as millstone, clothed in a double coat of scales so tight that no air could come between. It feared no bronze or iron blade. On earth it was a creature without fear. In heaven the gods feared Leviathan. Faith glanced at her sketchbook. Her fingers twitched with the desire to draw, to let loose the visions that howled at the gates of her mind. She tried to look away. The colonel had been clear that he did not want her to draw. Had he left it out to test her? To take it back without permission would not only fail his test, it would be stealing. The sketchbook called to her as though the siren still lived within it. Faith did not know what she would do if she were caught, but the temptation was too great. Faith shoved the Bible and blanket aside. She fumbled in her pockets hanging with her dress until she found her pencil. Trembling with both terror and excitement, Faith snatched up the sketchbook. She scrambled back into bed and pulled the blanket up. The pencil was dull, but she could not pause to find the penknife to sharpen it. Spreading the book upon her bent knee, she took a single breath and began to draw. The pencil whispered over the paper, and the graphite glittered in the lamplight as she sketched the vision in her mind. So consumed was she that Faith no longer felt the movement of the ship or flinched at its creaks and cracks. Those things were now a part of the world that came to life beneath her pencil, a world of her own making. As the image in her mind leached onto the paper, her heart slowed its frantic pace and her muscles stopped their tremors. She drew quickly, feeling less like she was creating the image so much as revealing it. Faith had just turned to the details, a sharper line here, a darker shadow there, marveling that she had left to do them, when she became aware of footsteps in the hall outside the cabin door. Her heart skipped a beat and her face tingled as blood rushed from it. How quickly Faith had already forgotten her promise to do better. The colonel would be furious. She did not have time to put the sketchbook back. His hand was on the door. Faith shoved the sketchbook and pencil beneath her pillow and fell upon it. She closed her eyes. She heard the colonel enter. The effort to slow her panting breath in mimicry of sleep made her chest ache as though she were suffocating. He crossed the room toward her until his shadow darkened the light behind her eyelids. Faith felt him lift the Bible, still open on the bed, and heard it close with a soft thump. Through her lashes, she saw him turn away. The shadows swung crazily as he lifted the lamp down. A moment later, all was dark. Faith breathed a long, open-mouthed, and silent sigh of relief. Okay, as time passed. uh, Faith awoke to a crash in the dark cabin. The bunk lurched violently beneath her, throwing her against the wall. She could see nothing but a roar filled her ears. Far off, a bell clanged madly. Nearer, a man's voice shouted, "Douse the lamps! Douse all the lamps!" "Mamma, Colonel," she called out, her voice wavering. "I'm here," her mother replied, her voice equally small. "The Colonel has gone above." Faith half slid, half fell out of bed as the ship dove and plunged. She groped her way to her mother's bed, finding her hand in the darkness. It felt thin and cold and weak in Faith's grasp. They huddled together, shuddering within the ship as waves pounded against it. Faith felt the ocean's angry fist close about them. The darkness itself pressed in on her until she thought if she reached out, she could touch it. She choked for air against the tightness in her chest. Her mother sobbed and shook next to her. They both gasped as the ship pitched and a deafening crack tore through the roar of the wind and thunder. Her mother's sobs turned to retching, and the smell of sour wine and bile filled Faith's nose. Faith crawled away, her own stomach twisting. She stifled a gag. An eerie moan echoed through the water, and Faith's heart stopped in her chest. She could feel it coming, that thing that hunted her. A moment later, something slammed into the hull outside their cabin. The ship shivered. Panic exploded in Faith's mind. She had to get out of the cabin. Faith leapt from the end of the bed, gaining the door in a single footfall. She fell against the jamb and groped for the latch. Her fingers brushed the fabric of her coat. She tore it from its hook and shrugged into it before bursting into the pitch-black hall. Her mother shouted, "Faith, come back!" her words ending in a wet gurgle. Back pressed to the wall, Faith felt her way to the deck stairs. Loose things scraped and slid across the floor. Her eyes were locked on the rectangle of lighter darkness that marked the opening to the deck as though it were a pole star. As she passed the hatch to the tween deck, she retched. Fear and overturned chamber pots had intensified the smell. She could hear people crying out from below. Water spilled from above, cascading down the stairs and over her feet. Faith grasped the railing and pulled herself to the upper deck. She emerged into a nightmare. Menacing black clouds swirled overhead and reached down to meet the heaving sea. All boundaries between sea and sky were gone, converging into a roiling mass of wind and water. A flash of lightning revealed the rocky coast, ominously close. The wind was driving them towards it. Faith covered her ears at the clap of thunder that followed. A fierce gust of warm, moist air like the breath of a giant beast slammed into her. Stinging rain flew horizontally, shielding her eyes. Faith scanned the deck for the colonel. All around, the crew worked frantically to secure the ship while the captain barked orders from the quarterdeck. "Cut it free," she heard him yell before the wind reduced his command to urgent pantomime. The helmsman stood his post, a look of grim determination on his face. Another flash of lightning brought Faith's eyes skyward to where the splintered remains of the upper mainmast stabbed the sky like a broken sword. Stays and tangled rigging draped across the deck and over the railing. Sailors scrambling among the lines. The ship rode up an enormous swell, bow pointed to heaven, and hovered weightless at the top. Faith had the giddy sense that the ship was flying until it tipped back down the wave and crashed into a black valley in the sea. Faith was thrown from her feet. Water washed over her. She clutched at a stanchion as a thundering boom reverberated through the ship. Beyond where the sailors worked to cut the dragging lines, a line of windblown foam described another rising swell. Faith watched in horror as it grew, a great wall of water higher than the deck. The ship listed into the trough that opened before it, the deck slanting away from Faith until she felt like she was hanging above the abyss. She saw a shadow in its depths, thick and serpentine. Her eyes followed it up into the gathering wave. Lightning arced through the clouds above, turning the water translucent. In its obsidian wall, she saw a horned head, the white cap of the wave above it like a crown, glowing eyes fixed on her. Leviathan. The beast lunged toward her like a striking snake, carrying the crest of the wave with it. Faith tried to scream, but no sound came out. Salt water filled her mouth and eyes as the wave threatened to scour her from the deck. Faith wrapped herself tighter around the stanchion, pressing her face to the wet wood, panting in fear. Water pelted her from above and below for what seemed like a lifetime. It was all she could remember and all she could think forward to. And then, through the roar of the wind and water, she heard her name. Faith, the colonel yelled. What are you doing up? Another tremendous boom like a battering ram on a fortress gate sent the colonel stumbling. Another shockwave ran through the ship. When Faith screamed this time, it was sharp and full of terror. Mr. Trumbull, the captain shouted into a lull. Get below deck this instant. Turning to a nearby sailor, he yelled, seal those hatches. The colonel tore Faith from the stanchion and carried her down the stairs with an arm around her waist. Overhead, a sailor closed the hatch like an undertaker lowering the lid of a coffin. Faith's strength left her, and she sagged in the colonel's grip. In a daze, she heard him muttering, Colonel Trumbull. It's Colonel Trumbull, Captain. The colonel dropped Faith on her bed and latched the door to the cabin. Faith put a foot to the floor, but recoiled when it touched pooling water. She huddled against the wall of her bunk, her hands brushing against something in the tangled linens. Her sketchbook. She closed her eyes and clutched it to her chest. She did not pray to God for salvation. She prayed for a phoenix.
Wow, that was intense. So like, so okay, so he comes into her room, and then somehow, like, I guess, like what happened to the ship?
So the ship is in a storm. So part of the
Okay, it was a storm.
part
Okay.
of the historical accuracy that I was talking about is that on September 15th of 1815, I think it was 15th, 17th, there was they estimate about a category 3 or 4 hurricane that struck New York.
Oh, I remember this.
And according to, so a lot of this, the historical facts behind that underpin the story, come from Colonel Trumbull's own autobiography. And the man had a knack for being present at important points in history, not as an actor, but sort of as a spectator, but still there. And it just so happens that his ship was caught in, like, this is an actual passage that he and his wife made, and they were actually caught in that hurricane.
Oh, wow.
And so they are caught in that hurricane, and in Faith's mind, in her imagination at least, she has potentially created this situation.
I was wondering about that, but yeah.
So then the next chapter sort of gives you a little bit of recap where, yes, that was a hurricane, and no, she's not drawing anymore because she scared the crap out of herself. But that's what was happening, is she, in her mind, believes that she created this problem.
Oh, the poor dear.
Yes. So for a while, she swears off all art, and really doubles down and devotes herself to being a very dedicated and obedient and very, hardworking, dutiful young woman that he would expect. But that doesn't last very long.
Oh, the poor dear.
Yeah.
That's awful that she thinks she caused that. Wow. I could see how that would scare me if I thought I'd caused some kind of storm.
Well, and she does debate, could she possibly, she hears some sailors gossiping after the fact as they limp their way into harbor, that, they saw a beast. But are those just more, sailors always see things, right? Or blame things. And then she questions whether or not she could be responsible for Leviathan and not responsible for the Phoenix as well. Because ultimately, as she's in this moment of danger, she calls upon the Phoenix that she had drawn earlier. And it's as she's praying essentially for that Phoenix that, the system, the problem resolves itself. But like all of us, it's far easier to believe that she was responsible for the negative than the positive. So
yeah, that's a powerful statement, but it's true.
Mm-hmm. So she's much more inclined to think that she called up Leviathan somehow, in some way, but not the phoenix that, kind of helped to save them. Not that anything like comes down out of the sky or anything like the phoenix, but that, the fact that, the danger ended right about the time that, she was, you know, putting that into her mind. She doesn't feel she can take responsibility for that. So really, of course, what it was, the mainmast of the ship had been broken, and with every swell was ramming into the side of the ship during the storm. So anyway, so that is the pattern of the book, where I took actual real historical events and then inject the fantasy into the gaps, or
That's
to
so
explain them.
cool.
So yeah, it was kind of fun putting it together that way.
That's a really cool way to write a story. I've never thought of doing anything like that.
Well, originally the story started out as, obviously it started with the magical ink, and uh, that was just, it turned into this really compelling magic system in my mind. But then I needed a story to use it, and I think my first thought was to do sort of a magic school, a magic academy kind of thing, where some teens learn to use this ink. And I wanted, if they were doing that, the imaginary, the fantasia side of things, to be sort of, present a challenge of its own. And I imagined this sort of ghost of a disgruntled artist toying with them while they're in there. So, not only are they trying to learn how to use this stuff with its own inherent issues, but they're kind of getting messed with when they're working on it. And so I wanted to look back into history, to find a historical figure or a time where I could draw that disgruntled artist. And if you go all the way back to the Renaissance, it turns out women weren't actually as sidelined as you might think. So I really didn't even go back that far. We're finding more and more attributions that have been previously made to men were actually, women in the Renaissance. But if you go back to this early 1800s and into the mid 1800s, um, with the exception of women being encouraged to have a moderate level of talent across all disciplines, like I started out at the beginning saying, it really was not appropriate. It was really a challenge and an affront to society for them to have any exceptional talent or to put it on display. I mean, that was just absolutely scandalous, right? So, doing my research at this time period really jumped out at me that, if you were exceptional in one of those disciplines in some way at this time period, what were you to do? You know? And it just sort of built from there. So once I found a time period, I had to kind of look for artists. Like I said, I kind of was committed to, because, I have a background in history. I was kind of committed to finding real historical figures that I could sort of insert this into. And so I was like, okay, well, who would have been a prominent artist that you could have looked back and say, oh yeah, if there were a guild, who would have been leading it? And so I kind of like picked one from each country, usually the heads of the Royal Academies. And John Trumbull was the head of the Royal Academy. And so I did a little research, or the American Academy of Art, early on. And so I did a little research on him. And then, like, in his autobiography, it was like finding a pot of gold. The guy had such a crazy existence and was so ripe for being turned into a villain, with my apologies, Mr. Trumbull, Colonel Trumbull. He was very, very particular. And the talk about, wanting a legacy, that's taken virtually word for word from his autobiography. I mean, I really tried to
Wow.
pull on his actual thoughts as much as possible. While, of course, like I said at the beginning, otherwise totally fictionalized, but he really gave a foundation that I could build on. You know, he was kind of a controversial figure even in his own time. So,
Wow.
yeah, so there were, in addition to his own words, then there were also some contemporaries who wrote about him, and not usually very favorably. So, you get lots of gossip to work with.
That's really cool. How did you like stumble upon this? You were just like, was it like Googling or you were reading other books? Like how did you stumble upon him?
I just, like I said, just trying to doing like Google search. So I have a background both in art and in history, kind of separate, not specifically art history, but enough to sort of give me an intro. Um, so I mostly, when I was looking for like a time period or these potential guild masters, I was just sort of Googling like um most famous artists in America, 1815 or 1800s. And so I would just sort of go through and, just give a cursory Wikipedia type look at all of them. And really, he was the only American who was so politically prominent that it really just flagged like, hey, look into this guy more. And then when it turned out he had an autobiography that I not only had his story in detail, but then I had, commentary from his contemporaries in other sources, it turned out. It just all kind of felt the scaffolding of the story then just really fell together. And then, I got to play with the fantasy element on top of that, which
So
was
base
a really fun way to put it together.
Yeah, so basically from beyond the grave, he auditioned for a role in this book in a
Yeah,
way.
pretty much, pretty much.
He left you all the materials. That's really neat. You s- you
Yeah.
s- you said that the magic system in this book. Let's talk about that. Like,
Yeah,
so we've got
absolutely.
the
I mean, that's
ink.
the fantasy
Yeah,
portion, right?
yeah.
Um, so yeah, so the like I was saying before, in within the story, the ink just represents concentrated imagination. So if you imagine, or you could call it inspiration, if you imagine the inspiration is sort of like the ether or like water vapor in the air, it's around us, but we can't see it. The ink is this, and it contains every element, every emotion, everything that you can imagine, every possibility. And if it gets sufficiently concentrated for a variety of reasons, whether the impact of a particular genius on it, like kind of I was proposing with Da Vinci, the conflict of curiosity and fear just really heightened his emotions, or in this part of the story that I just read, Faith's imagination being fired by that passage from the Bible and the description of this terrifying beast. It in those instances of extreme inspiration, the ink can kind of coalesce and turn into a physical uh, element, a liquid that can then be used. And so um, the artists can, it never runs out. So you can dip like a pen in ink, the ink, and use it forever, pretty much. So long as your imagination still flows, the ink still flows. You never need to reload the pen. Um, and it does what it's sort of the pen itself is just a conduit of your thoughts and imagination to this ink, and it is only limited by what you believe to be impossible. So if you have enough imagination or the talent to use it, but like the Colonel, you come in with a lot of preconceived notions about how things are and aren't, his ability to employ it is inherently blindered by those belief systems. But if, like Faith, you are learning to be, once she's set free by it, she learns, is utterly unhindered by constructs and becomes increasingly so to the point where you could be invisible, you could fly. Um, you can pretty much do anything that you can conceive of doing.
So the ink is something that's like inside everybody basically, because we all have some imagination. Some people use it more than others. Okay. So it's not like you don't need to go to the store and buy the special magical ink. It's already everywhere inside you. You just tap into it by believing.
Essentially, yeah. So the way it's set up in the book is that you have a talent for using it, right? Like There are some people, and I think, we all know one or two of those people who just seem to have no imagination, like very, very literal thinkers. I have one or two in my family who just, they only see what's like right before them. And so those people would be sort of categorized in this world as visionless, but only because the guild is kind of hoity-toity. What they fail to really acknowledge is that, yes, it is within everybody. Those people just haven't figured out how to tap it. But as far as the guild is concerned, there are only certain people who really have the ability to use this ink, meaning that they are in touch enough with that imaginative side to command the ink to make it do what they want. And so there are some people, one of the things that Faith has experienced all her life that you sort of find out of in the next chapter or so is that she has always seen paintings move, sort of like the paintings in Harry Potter, that have sort of like movement and whatever. But, she'll stand in front of a painting by a master and she can, smell the breeze and hear the trees rustle, and she sees the movement and, hears the sheep's bells, and like paintings have always sort of been alive for her. But in a way you never really expect that other people can't see that, or you're told, to damp down your imagination. So she really doesn't give into it. But anything that was done by an old master in the ink would have that kind of power, whatever amount of power they wanted to put into it. Because of course it can also always be dangerous. You don't want to do, St. George and the dragon and like make the dragon capable of like, taking a swipe at the viewers. That might not be good for business.
No.
Right. So, but also this is one of the reasons within the story that you're never supposed to touch a painting. It's because you don't know what you might interact with. So certain people have the ability to see. So they're kind of levels, right? Some people, so literal, no vision. Then there are people who can see it and appreciate it and are responsive to it, but don't necessarily have the ability to use it if they were given the opportunity. And then there are people who have the ability to use it, and that is like any magic system, there are varying degrees of strength, right? And so Faith is obviously exceptionally gifted in that regard. And that's due to the power of her imagination and less so to her ability actually to create art. So this would be something that exists in everyone, even if they can't draw a stick figure. And theoretically also would sort of explain little spikes of genius during periods of history where, like the Renaissance or, the scientific discoveries, like when Einstein was alive, where it just seems like new discoveries coming out all the time, is that there are these waves of people who are sort of tapping into this magical or, more physical element of inspiration, and can apply it in all kinds of different ways.
No, that's really cool.
So yeah, it was a really fun one to toy with. And this is a standalone.
Oh, I was going to ask that.
Well, so it's intended as a standalone because it is my debut. And, I just kind of wanted to have sort of a one and done, or not one and done, but just sort of, a standalone to start with. But obviously this leaves room for lots of different avenues with either different characters or, without giving away anything about, the ending, there is a possibility to bring Faith back into it as well. Sort of other aspects of her journey. Because by the end, you realize this is not confined to the world of art. Writers tap into this, and inventors and scientists and stuff like that. So
what about map makers? What if they tapped into it? Like, what would happen? Like,
no, that's in fact, it's those kinds of things where I have like a little list of like other places I could take this. And yeah, I mean, if a map maker, tried to do this ink and like rework the world, well, yeah, that would be a fun little story right there, right?
Like, could they just add another continent or 5?
Well, they could within the imaginary world, and people could sort of walk into that. For them to reorder this world, they would have to be exceptionally powerful. And kind of the only people who would be susceptible to it would be those who can appreciate it,
Okay. I'm just thinking
theoretically. But
yeah, I'm just thinking about a documentary that I watched earlier this year about the history of maps and how wildly inaccurate some of them are, and how some of them would put things on the map just so that they would know if someone copied their map. So there's islands that don't exist. California, they once thought was an island and you could
yes,
sail through half of it. Like
yes,
it was so interesting, the history of maps, like, and then he went into at the end how like the maps that we used to buy, those physical maps, they're
yes.
projections of a three-dimensional sphere on a two-dimensional piece of paper, and there's like 30 or 40 different ways that you can project that, and they all reshape the way the earth looks. So like that would be interesting to play with. What if a bunch of exceptional people had different maps that were made with different different types of those projections, because they'd be looking at, yes, it's the real world, but their representation they're looking at it is not accurate
No, you're
to begin
absolutely
with.
right. You're
Yeah,
absolutely right. I mean, the maps that we're so used to looking at are usually what Mercator maps, and
they're not
because it
accurate.
takes the top of
Yeah,
the globe like this, we all think of Greenland as being massive. Because of the way
yeah.
we're used to seeing it on our weather maps, or whatever. It's actually much smaller than I think we commonly think of. And so yeah, perfect. You get a bunch of you give one of these map makers a little access to the ink, and now we have a new shipping lane, and then somebody else closes it off, and I mean.
I mean, that could be wildly fun, especially like you like what effect do people who can see it and appreciate it, and they're all looking at maps that were created with different projections where things are wildly different shaped and stuff. Like how does that collective experience that we're looking at reality as the two-dimensional reality of it, and everybody's seeing it differently, how does that affect the real world? Does it affect the real world?
Well, right. Yeah. So, that kind of remains to be explored. I think it would also be fun if all the little, sea creatures and like fantasy creatures that they always populated their maps with were, that came to life as well. At least the old maps.
Yeah.
We don't have that kind of fun anymore. But no, that would be a really cool application. But you can see why Da Vinci created the guild, right? You can't just be giving this stuff out willy-nilly.
Yeah, yeah, no. And what happens to people who are not in the guild who use this? Do they get hunted down?
That actually is a key question.
So
Uh,
that we find out in the book.
yes, you do.
No, this is wild. Um, what is your so now that this is out and it's a standalone, are you writing anything else?
Oh my gosh, I have stacks and stacks and stacks, which is kind of one of the reasons I wanted to make this one a standalone, was just sort of get it done, get it out in the world, and move on. So I have two competing projects that I'm working on right now. So my history background is when I very first started writing fiction, because I had been I've done a lot of I've seen a lot of things. I used to be an attorney. I used to be an archaeologist, and in my archaeology time, I wanted to write historical fiction about Hatshepsut, ancient Egyptian queen. I think most of us know about her now, but at the time, nobody knew who she was. And I was like, oh my God, this woman needs to be brought to the forefront because she's really cool. And I got so wrapped around the axles trying to make sure that the history was accurate that I managed to research myself into a degree, but no book. So yeah, so I have a diploma in Egyptology because of the research on that book. So beware to all of those out there who think they want to write historical fiction or historical fantasy. Be careful. Just research what you need to know and move on. So
But at
one of
least
the
you got
things.
a degree out of it. So it's not like
Yeah, I know. So,
some authors who are like, I did all this research and I got nothing out of it.
right?
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I have an official piece of paper and everything. Um, so one of the manuscripts, of course, that or I have is probably going to be a duology. I don't think it'll go into a trilogy. Um, is instead of Hatshepsut, when I was getting my diploma, I discovered an even cooler warrior queen of ancient Egypt that without her, we would have none of what we associate with ancient Egypt. So
Oh,
Hatshepsut, King Tut, Ramses the Great, everything from the 18th dynasty on is really what people think of when they think of ancient Egypt, the names that they can name. And if she had not stepped up, Egypt would have ended because the country was split into two, two or three separate pieces, and there was a war, and she was the queen, but the pharaoh of her little portion of Egypt at the time was killed in battle, and her son, the heir to the throne, was only like 5 years old. So it fell to her to reunite the country and expel the people in the north. And if she had failed at that, um, Egypt would have become part of Syria, Palestine, and not continued on as the Egypt that we know. So I mean, it would
wow.
have existed in some format, but not. But Tut, like I said, Tut and Ramses and all those people just would not have existed. And so she is really, really amazing to me, and I really want to get her story out. But because I am a fantasy lover and whatever, I'm going to kind of do the same approach that I did with this one, where I'm going to make it as historically accurate that all of the fantasy elements will be consistent with historical fact, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, that's really neat. Will it
So
be a similar magic system or something different?
it's going to be completely Egyptianized magic. So the myth of Osiris and Isis is pretty much the origin story for mummification and a lot of other elements of Egyptian magic. And I am going to turn that, I have turned that into the magic system there. So underlying this fight for control of Egypt and reunifying it, there is sort of a supernatural battle to control the magic that underlies the land and the Egyptian religion. Right. So
Oh,
there's like quests for artifacts and putting things together, and um, a la mummification in an abstract sense, where with the mummy, they collected the body parts, wrapped them together, and then magically revivified it. So sort of in that concept of when you bring these powers together, that they can be used together as a greater whole, and bestows a certain amount of power on the user, and that's what these two kingdoms are really fighting for control over. But set historically accurately within the battle for reunification of Egypt before the 18th dynasty. So that's that project. And I'm going to try and push the first book out on that one. I'm hoping summer of this year. And then the other project that I have going is the first book in a very long series, probably 8, 9, 10 books. That is classic epic fantasy. The only little leak of historical stuff is that will be the competing races and lands and so on and so forth will be scaffolded on ancient societies. So instead of your typical medieval kind of thing, I'll be drawing on ancient Persia, ancient Central Africa, Inca, Mayan, Asian, civilizations as sort of the foundation for those, kind of all over the globe, but ancient. And so it's that magic system is that's the one I think that lives rent free in my brain the most. I live with it all the time. That magic system is based on color, which has been done in a few other kinds of things, like the Black Prism and I think Warbreaker and some other stuff. But this one is a light based system where there is a race of celestial dragons that represent the divided prismatic elements of a creative force. That was a lot of weird words. So if you imagine that the sun, kind of like the ink, right, like the sunlight contains every possible element of everything, and then you hold up a prism and it divides it
yeah.
into
I
all of
have
those wavelengths.
I have a similar magic system from my fantasy book, so I got it immediately when
Okay,
you
so
said
you
it.
understood. I was
But
just, I was
but
like, there was a
explain.
lot.
Yeah, explain for everyone else.
Yeah, so there was a lot of abstraction at first, but essentially you're taking this creative force, sunlight, dividing it out into its wavelengths, and each wavelength, of course, represents different power structures. That part in and of itself isn't terribly unique, but it's what you do with it, right? And it has to be understandable. So, I mean, like you can understand, prisms and separating and colors, and that's cool. But then we have sort of a celestial race of dragons that represent each of these colors, and they've been wiped off the map. And now we have sort of an imminent celestial alignment that is going to, exactly like you were just saying with the map makers, is going to completely remake the world.
Oh,
Right?
wow.
Because the way the way these creative forces get dispersed in my book is there is the sun and there is a moon that is completely crystalline that acts as a celestial prism. And when the two line up and the different wavelengths strike the planet, the magic principle for each of those bands of color can like remake the surface of the earth. So the wavelength that would be
That's
related to
wild.
water would like gather the seas, and the one that's related to, plant matter and stuff and life would like grow forests or kill everything, right? Because duality. And so this is imminent, but really nobody knows about it except, a couple of characters. And they have to figure out a way to resurrect this race of dragons that have a protective, because their magic is strong enough to regulate and introduce the balance.
If they want to. I mean, they might have to
If they want
convince
to,
them that, like,
if
yeah, we're
yeah,
bringing you back and you need to help us.
right, exactly. And so that one has been that one is like my heart book, right? Like, there's probably a story that everybody is like, this is the most important one. And so that's probably going to be later this year that the first one comes out, maybe like fall, because I'm going to probably work and rework and love over that one for quite a bit. Also because it's the longest one, so I'll try and get the others closer to completion before I, really fully commit to that. So anyway, that one's, I've got a revised rough draft, and it just needs some loving. So that's what's in the works. Hopefully a couple more out this year.
That's cool though with the moon. I don't even know what the moon in my fantasy world does. It's there.
Well, so how does your color magic work?
It's it's more it's not just it's not just color, it's elemental. So it basically there's way back when everything was created, you know,
Yes.
God went off for, all right, I spent 7 days and made everything. I'm going to take a vacation. He created some other gods, lesser gods. You guys handle things. I'm going to rest.
Right.
I'm going to chill out.
Supervisor God.
I'm going to do something else. You handle things. Things didn't go so well. So, and so there was like those lesser gods that he created were just supposed to, administer, run things, take care of people. Basically, not things were not so great, so there ended up being they decided that we're doing all the work and he's just hanging out. This is not fair. So
Right.
there was the war in heaven
Okay.
at angels versus gods, and they lost the gods. That's why we don't have them anymore. They lost.
Right. Right.
They
Okay.
went. Yeah, they went. So basically, every time like there was a big cataclysmic thing, the magic changed, because like he created the demigods, he created these lesser gods. It didn't quite work. They got thrown down into hell. The ones that like didn't fight against the creator god, you guys get to hang out, but I'm limiting
Right.
your magic because I don't like what your friends did.
Right. Right.
And
Right.
they had way too much power, so the ones that didn't fight against it, that got to hang around, were like, that's fine because I had more magic than I wanted to have anyways, and it was driving me crazy. Thanks for limiting it. Now I can hang out, have a good time, let the good times roll. And so there's been a bunch of different magical like cataclysms, or like war. Like there've been Chris, like, you know what? I really don't like what's going down. I'm gonna break the magic and
Okay.
keep limiting it down so people can't do things that I don't like. So
Right.
in the time that my books take place, this is like the magic has been changed and reformed now 3 or 4 times.
Okay.
So what they have is a very stratified system.
Okay.
So it is partially light based, it is partially elemental based, and so um the way that the light magic is the one that's based on light
Mhm.
is so there's that system, but there's also dark magic, which is completely different.
Yes. Yes.
And so that's it. So in the light magic, you have all the elements. You get the fire magic, and that's red. If you
Yep.
have fire magic, your eyes glow red when you're using magic. So if you're not using magic, your eyes don't glow. People don't know you have magic. It's just a visual like warning system, so other people, okay, you're using magic, I'm gonna walk away from you, kind of
Right.
thing.
Right. Right. Right.
Yeah, if you have earth magic, which my dude does,
Mhm.
on YouTube I have the background from the cover of Curse Breaker Enchanted, which is just Sarn, big, large, and in charge with the
Yep.
green magic because he's using earth magic. But the color is not super helpful because within earth magic there's stone magic, there's plant magic,
Right.
there's a whole bunch of there's metal magic, there's a whole, so it just because someone's eyes are glowing green and they're using some form of earth magic, but you're not quite sure, is the rock going to shoot up, is the tree going to move, not sure what's going on with you, I'm going to wander away from you.
Right.
But
Right.
yeah,
Right.
so it is it's I in the books none of the characters know any of this. They only know about the elemental magic because that's the most visible. Your eyes glow. People who
Yes.
use dark magic, there's no visible sign that they are doing anything.
Right.
And dark magic is basically like telepathy, anything that you can't see what is happening.
Okay.
But like with earth magic, you can, the tree moved. There's a
Mhm.
visible thing that happens. So and the light based magics where something physically is happening, you can if you have any sort of magical gift, you can actually see the magic, and it is that color, and you can see it going out from the person casting it, touching the object, manipulating it or whatever.
Right.
But
Right.
with dark magic, even if you have dark magic, you can't see what they're doing. So you could be using your own dark magic to do something, and somebody else standing next to you could be using theirs. Neither of you can see it because dark magic does not give off light.
Right. Right.
There's more
Cool.
to it, but that's the basics. And like in the stories, like I'm mostly read about the light magic, although I'm getting into the dark magics lately. But like light and dark doesn't mean good or evil. It's still it is the intent of the caster that decides if it's good, if this is good magic or bad magic. It has nothing to do with dark magic or light magic. That's all
Mhm.
just based on like what can you see the magic.
Right. Well, and that's a similar issue that I had in mind, is that just there's sort of a preconceived notion. Well, actually, in mine, all magic is bad based on some poor experiences that civilization had kind of in general, due to the use of this magic, which is why the dragons are gone. The there's sort of a preconceived notion underlying historically in the book, that the light magic is better, right? But that there is also a dark form of magic, and it's not anything inherent in the magic, it's how you're using it, right? It's what
Yeah.
they're using it for. So very similar line of reasoning there. um, so yeah, I love magic systems.
No, I do too. It's just, and mine is more like a spectrum. There's the light magic on one side, the
Rather
dark
than dark
magic
magic
on
on the
the
other.
other. Yeah, and there is this gray area in the middle where things get weird, but we don't deal with that in the books too much because it's too hard to explain to people. But magic, whether
I'm
you have
sure you
light
have
or
notes and notes and notes about what
oh, of
happens and
course.
all the weird permutations
Oh
of
yeah,
the
gray magic is bizarre.
is,
But
if this, then that. Yeah.
yeah, and there's also a spectrum of like how magical are you? Because on one side there are people who are super magical, and then there are people on the other side who are nulls, where magic doesn't work around that.
Right, right. Of course. Yeah.
And the fun happens when what happens if you have a set of twins and one is a null and one is a super powerful mage.
Oh, well, that's a really cool setup. There you
Yeah,
go.
I,
Yeah.
I I did that. His twin sister was a null.
Okay.
Um, yeah, she's
Yeah,
not alive
I
anymore.
haven't read that one, but it sounds like I really should.
She's not. He finds out about her in book at the end of book 1, he remembers her, and then she starts to show up in book 4. She
Okay.
died when they were children, and but like that's not the end in this. It's a very magical thing. So like as we have on Earth, lots of magic. There's all sorts of levels in between being alive and dead.
Yes, I mean,
And
come on, Wesley was only mostly dead, so,
well, she's all dead, but as a spirit, like there is an afterlife, and there's all different
Mhm,
places you can go. There's magic in there,
mhm,
and she's decided she doesn't really care what you're supposed to do once you're passed away. She's going to go back and help her family because that's the last thing she remembers.
right,
So she
okay.
ends up going from a ghost to being an angel to being the angel of death. that's
Oh,
that's
that's
her
an interesting
current
career
job.
path.
Yeah, she's not happy about that.
Okay.
Somebody tricked her into taking the mantle of power because she wasn't powerful enough to stop something. So like, if you take up this mantle of power, which was literally a scarf, this magical scarf, it will you'll have the power to fix this. And she's like, okay, I want to stop the world from being destroyed because my family lives there. I don't want them to die.
Right?
And then she's like, okay, mission accomplished. How do I take this off? How do I give this back? I don't want to be the angel of death. I just needed it for 5 minutes.
No,
Oh no,
I'm done now,
it's
right? So it's like a
yeah.
Santa Claus. Does she need somebody to like like kill her so that she can hand it off?
I don't know how she can get how she can because it was kind of a loophole that she got it because the other
Yeah.
one anyway, when people read that book, it's in there because the previous angel of death like gives up the mantle to become one of death, the rider of the apocalypse.
Okay.
So you know, and she's
Awesome.
not happy that this girl took over her job.
Oh,
So
well, so that, she wants to give it back, maybe. So, well,
yeah, but not
that sounds really interesting.
yeah, but she's not doesn't want to give it back to the person who like was helping to destroy the world. So
No,
like
certainly not. No.
yeah, so
Probably
we'll
not
see
a
what.
good, yeah, probably not a good move. Yeah.
Yeah, and her angel superiors don't want her to give it up. They like, "You did this to yourself. Now you need to learn your lesson."
Right? There's always this thing, where, better you doing it than somebody else. So, suck it up.
Well, it's also like in corporate offices, like you do a job, something needs to get done, and you're like, "Oh, hell, I'll just do it. It needs to get done." And then you now
Right.
own it. Now,
Now
every
it's
time
you.
that thing needs to get done, you have to do it because you now own it. It's that kind of situation, like, well, you did it, now you own it.
Yep, absolutely.
Good luck.
Yeah, it's always a little bit of a curse to be good at something if you don't actually want to do that. So, yeah.
I don't know if she'd even be good at it. I think that's the reason they want her to keep it. They just wanna see what will happen.
Okay, right
'Cause,
on.
like, as the angel of death, you have to take people's who are dying, take their souls to the afterlife. Like, is she actually going to do it is the big question.
Right? Okay. Okay. That sounds really
So,
cool.
yeah, it's but I think I'm very interested in the Egyptian warrior queen.
Oh, she's
Um,
amazing.
what's
She
her
is
name?
Ahotep.
Ahotep, okay, that's
Ahotep.
cool.
Mhm.
I'm
So a
like,
little
why
bit like,
didn't
and that has been one of the struggles I've had. Do I stick with all the original Egyptian names, or are people gonna get all tripped up on them? I mean, I'm into historical accuracy as far as, that's concerned. I mean, obviously with the whole fantasy thing added to it. Um, but, yeah, so a little bit like Imhotep, but it's Ahotep, so.
that's not too hard, and, like,
No,
she
that
could
one's not
have
too hard, but a few of them really do start to, like, some of them are super easy, like uh, her
could
mother-in-law is Queen Tedasheri.
could
Tedasheri is quite,
yeah.
approachable.
Could they
Um,
have nicknames? Like, I'm sure they had
they did, actually, they did, but
or,
that
like
gets sort of
yeah.
confusing because, well, not terribly, it doesn't get too confusing, but they did all have nicknames because, like, half of ancient Egypt, they all had the same names, right? Because it was honoring a god, right? Like, you know, um, you know, uh, we say Ramses, but it was really Ra Mosa. It means born of Ra. So there was Amun Mosa and there was Ra Mosa, and like, pick your god, and then you add Mosa to the end of it. And whichever god was prevalent at the time, like half the population was named that. Or Hotep, which means pleased. So you could have Ra-Hotep, Amenhotep. Once again, pick your Sobek Hotep, pick your god, add Hotep to the end, and like a lot of people had that name. So just for society to function, people definitely had nicknames. But then your reader has to track, like, oh yeah, that person is that nickname, unless you just never even introduced the original name. So those are some of the little tidbits and details that historical fantasy sort of injects that you kind of have to twiddle with, that I don't think, the epic fantasy, because in epic fantasy, if you run into a problem, well, you just make up a solution.
True.
But historical fantasy, you're like writing and writing, and then you're like, oh, I need this thing to happen. And then you're like, could that have happened? Did they have that technology, or would they have done that? And then you have to go down a little rabbit hole of research, to try not to get in hot water with, the people who might be able to catch you out if you make a mistake. So,
Well, what you could do is like introduce them as their real name, and then but everybody just calls me X, and then you could have in the back all the nicknames and what they're like, so that
yeah,
way for people who want to keep track of who's who, they've got the glossary. For everybody
yeah,
else, okay, we got the acknowledgement that this is a real historical person who was named X, but this is the name that we're using in the story to make it, maybe that's the name that they used back then, or that this is the name that we're going to call them in the story for to make things easier to follow. Because I've
yeah.
seen that even in epic fantasy books where the author wanted something with like some crazy like bunch of consonants together that no one knows
There's
how to
some name with
pronounce.
3 Q's and we have no idea how to pronounce it.
Yeah, and they're like, just call me Q, and like
Yeah.
So then here's the big beautiful name that I created, but because I know you can't follow that, I'm gonna
Right.
give you something easier, you
Right.
know.
Yeah,
And some
absolutely.
people don't. Some people just use the thing with the 5 Qs and the 3, what are those,
Yeah, the apostrophes and all that, and then
apostrophes.
when you're reading
Yeah.
it, you're just kinda like, "Oh, that name. Oh, that
I
name."
try I try to make them phonetic, because then, it's easy to spell. And the
Yeah.
likelihood of me misspelling their name is very small if it's spelled how it sounds.
I know, isn't that the truth, right? When you're typing and you're writing and you're like, "Oh my god, I can't even remember." I had in the epic fantasy, the names of cities keep screwing me up. Like I have I have a system for how I've named the cities. Like I have a translation guide, right? So this is like Stone City, and then it translates to whatever. But there's one where it was like I couldn't remember how I every time I typed it, I had to look at where I had written it down, because I was like, what order did I where did I put that? Um, so I think I need to simplify that one, because if I can't follow it, other people can't follow it. But
I make them phonetic too.
yeah, yeah, need to simplify, a few things, not sticking to the strict translation I came up with. So
Or change the translation rules to
yes,
fit.
exactly. Well, I mean, yeah, that's kind of where I'm going with that, is that,
Yeah.
I kind of created a little bit of a puzzle for myself. So I need to simplify that, which is why that one like just still needs some loving. And the Egyptian one is obviously something, I mean, I've been working on that. I mean, the original inspiration for a different character started, I don't know, probably 10 years ago. So, um,
Oh, you gotta get that out.
yeah, so I
That
need
that
to like
brainchild needs to come out and meet the world.
yes, and also there's just really not a lot of Egypt-based fantasy, and, I mean, there's definitely some, don't get me wrong, but given the overall popularity of ancient Egypt as a cultural topic, right? Like, I mean, people love ancient Egypt stuff, um, and yet there's not a lot of fantasy that intersects with that, so I feel like, um, dragons aren't going anywhere. The dragon thing will be dragons are evergreen. There's not going anywhere. But I feel like there's a little bit of a hole that I can plug with, adding to the corpus of Egypt-based stuff that I think fans both of fantasy and ancient Egypt, of which there are many, can kind of converge. And I think that might be kind of fun. So
No, it sounds awesome to me. I like Egypt-based fantasy, and you're right, there's not a whole lot out there. But you could kind of do dragons because, like, in ancient Egypt, don't they, like, worship, like, the crocodile? And crocodiles kind of sort of look like wingless dragons.
Well, actually, they had the demon, so it's kind of a dragon. I mean, I can definitely, because I'm also an artist, and so I'm going to be pushing out art that goes with the books. Uh, just life
special
happens. I don't.
editions.
Yeah, so yeah, exactly. And do some edge painting on some hardbacks and some digital art and posters. Anyway, so got lots of things in the works. But in ancient Egypt, the ultimate demon that would devour souls in the netherworld and was a threat to the sun rising every day is a winged serpent.
There you
So
go, dragons.
dragon, but Egypt style. So
Well, I mean, who's to say that? I mean, we got dragons from somewhere,
exactly.
and it who's to say it wasn't ancient Egypt?
Right. Well, theoretically, actually, we probably, especially because of the word Draco, which is a Greek word. I have heard the theory, and this may be apocryphal, but I've been told the theory that our concept of dragons came from the Greeks, who saw the skeletons of beasts in the deserts west of Egypt. Because a
See?
long time ago, ancient Egypt, where the Nile and everything is, it's depressed, and where the oases are, it's depressed. And so a long, long, long time ago, there was actually an ocean there. And there are actually whale fossils in the desert
See?
from bazillions of years ago. And that it was stuff like that that gave rise to the concept of dragons to ancient societies. So who knows, right? It could be.
I feel like you should have that, like, some kind of quote, maybe some you can even make it up, some kind of epigraph, with that,
Yes.
like, as, like, an ancient thing saying and then you be like, "See? There were dragons. There's gonna be dragons in the book." Or
Yep,
Egyptian
exactly.
version of
Egyptian
dragons.
dragon. That's right. Because
See? I rest my case.
there you
We
go.
got it.
Well,
And
everything is better with dragons. I mean, if I could turn the screen around, there's there's a lot of dragon going on in that wall there. On
and
my
the Greeks
bookshelf.
went everywhere, so, I mean
Yeah, and the Greeks took it. The Greeks took it everywhere. And obviously ancient Egypt was, I mean, it was a constant culture that you can recognize any piece of Egyptian art from the beginning for 3,000 years. It's recognizable. Like, it didn't change, and not, it did change, but in subtle ways. And it was a juggernaut. I mean, it was a cultural juggernaut at the time. Like, all the other civilizations around it picked up pieces of Egyptian visual representations and religion, and it influenced everything.
Well,
Um,
yeah, if it's been around that long, you're like, they must know what they're doing."
well, the
They've
Greeks
got
had
it
thought they
figured
did. They
out.
had the Greeks had total Egypt envy. It's absolutely hysterical. They try to like, Herodotus tries to base like so much of Egypt or Greek mythology, even saying, oh well, the Egyptians originated this, so it's valid. Like that was the stamp of approval. If he could somehow base everything in some sort of Egyptian foundation. So you know
And then the hilarious thing is the Romans borrowed everything heavily from the Greeks, so Egypt's influence continued
exactly, we'll never get away from it,
abstractly.
right?
Yeah. And the Romans have influenced so much of our world.
No, and it's, yeah, I mean, the Greek and Roman influence is obviously paramount in the Western world, and so it really came this way. It would be an interesting study, one I have not undertaken in all of my historical studies. Would be really interesting to trace if it had any influence going easterly, or if because of the Greeks it was really, because the Greeks took over ancient Egypt. If with Alexander the Great, and then Cleopatra and everything, because she was Greek, not Egyptian. They exported everything and we inherited it in the Western world. I am kind of curious how much influence you might find if you took Egyptian culture and looked eastward, especially, while they were powerful. But I don't think anybody's tried to synthesize that yet, which would be a really, I mean, so anybody out there is looking for a historical dissertation topic, there you go. You're welcome.
you could take that on too and see if there's a story there, because that would be interesting.
It would be really interesting. I just don't. I'm afraid to research myself into another degree.
You don't have enough yet.
No, the other part of the bookcase here that I'm looking at past my screen is my Egyptian library, and wow. So unless this book does really, really, really well, I'd have to fund a lot more book buying, a lot more research.
Well, you've also got that 10-book epic fantasy series.
That's exactly right. That I
Oh,
don't need any research for. That is the one where you just make it all up, and
or you could
you're in.
team up with an author who's very familiar with the Eastern side of things,
Yes,
and that could
yes.
be interesting.
Somebody who's well versed in, yes, in the Indus Valley or East Asian stuff. So that would be fantastic. And
Yeah.
and look for connections where you could see where are there synchronicities and which direction do we think the influence went.
Well, you definitely got to come back with all these things,
I
because
would love
we
to.
want to hear. We want updates. Did you
Okay.
find did you find that author? Is that sometime coming? And what has changed since you were last here? Which books have come out? How has the plan changed? Definitely want you to come back and give us that. Is there anything else you want to say about any of the many topics we talked about?
Yeah, no, I mean we've probably gone over time and we've ranged really widely, but I think it's been really interesting
Yeah.
and I appreciate it. No, the only thing that I would say about this particular book is right now it's on Kindle Unlimited until February 14th, where I'm gonna um, pull it out of KU just because you can't send copies to contests and things while it's in KU. Um, well, anyway, having things in KU really limits how you can distribute, the ebook. So until February 14th, it's in KU. So anybody who's curious after having read or heard the first 3 chapters, it's yours. It's free. If you're a subscriber, go follow your destiny. Otherwise, if you are interested in trying to get a free copy, I have a giveaway on Storygraph going up. The giveaway period will start January 18th, I believe. 19th, 18th, 19th, something like that, and runs until February 18th. So if anybody wants to score a free signed copy or the ebook, and you're on Storygraph, you can enter that giveaway, or just go add it to your TBR list now while you're thinking about it, and then when the giveaway opens, it'll notify you.
I didn't know
So
they did giveaways on there.
they are just starting to. It's a beta program. So if you log on and look now, they have a little giveaway tab, and you can see the current list of giveaways, which will be wrapping up like the 18th, and the winners announced, and then they'll start a new round the following day on the 19th. So
Do they charge to do that, like Goodreads does?
yes, they do. But because they're in beta, it's a bit more reasonable.
Okay.
And it also depends on Goodreads is sort of getting a black eye lately for review bombing and things like that. And there are a lot of authors who I hear sort of behind the scenes talking about I'm on Goodreads because I kind of have to be, like, because I have sort of a stranglehold on the industry, but they'd really rather not.
Yeah.
And so when, I've seen some polls on, Facebook groups and stuff about, like, how do you track your reading? Storygraph is really coming up. I mean, it's a close second now to Goodreads. Whereas a variety of the other, apps that allow you to track books and make recommendations, there's a lot of them, but none of them really have a significant market share. Storygraph's really coming up. So I'm interested to see how they go.
Yeah, I'd love to hear how that goes. I didn't know they had a program.
Yeah, they do. Well, they do now.
Yeah,
And if it
that's
goes well,
good to
they'll
know.
probably expand it. So
Yeah. That's exciting. It's good to hear that there are other offerings besides Goodreads. I try not to go on there. I didn't like it as a reader before I started publishing, and I'm less of a fan after becoming an author.
Right, exactly. And I think it's that sentiment that people are sort of trying to pull away, and not have to be as reliant on it. The Storygraph one, I mean, some people absolutely adore it. Some people don't find the features work for them, and that's true of every app. What I do find interesting about Storygraph is their way of tagging the pace and the moods of the books. So you can assign a tag that's like, this is medium paced. And like my book is tagged as inspirational because of the girl boss, girl power kind of thing. Um, and, I mean, there's things like adventurous and tense and, you know, scary or dark. There's dark. Like, so there are a variety of tags. And so that really helps a reader who might be, wanting to browse. Hey, this is what I'm in the mood for. I'm in the mood for cozy. I'm in the mood for dark. I'm in the mood for something slower and hopeful. Depending on, what you've just read and, what itch you need to scratch. So I think that's kind of a cool feature.
No, that is. I wasn't familiar with Storygraph. Like, I've heard of them, but
Mhm.
I don't really track. I listen to audiobooks. I
Well,
don't
you can
really.
track
I
audio, you
might.
can track audio on there too.
I tried tracking it in Goodreads at one point, but like finding the audio versions of it was difficult. I had a lot of difficulty with it, and there were things.
Too much friction for sure.
Well, it's when you search for the book, it's the ebook version, but sometimes there's some authors are audio first, and the audio version is not the same as the ebook version.
Right.
And
Right.
there's some things that are only on Audible that don't exist as an ebook, and you can't find it. And like, I had that a lot, and I was like, just got so frustrated. I was like, you know what? I don't care. I listen to a book a day anyways. Like, what am I really tracking?
Right, exactly. And if you don't have any need for it, then as a reader, why use it? But as an author, you explore all the tools, right? And you
Yeah.
try and find out which ones are connecting you with your readers. So it probably works better for certain genres than others, and then other format types, of course, right? So
Yeah, I'll have to give it a look because, like, I'm a little bit more. People sometimes ask for like recommendations, and I'm like, I read a whole bunch of things, but I don't remember what they were.
I was gonna say, I mean, if you're reading that much, right,
Yeah.
then and for you it would be just to have a list, right?
Yeah.
I mean, not that you need the work of writing a book report for each one, but just to keep track of, especially if people are asking for recommendations or that kind of thing. That would might be helpful just to have the list, and it would be a
That's what
place.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking because, like, Audible, I can see, like, what I listened to in the past, but, like, sometimes someone asks you for rec and like, "Oh, I read this great book in January," and, like, there's no way to tell in Audible what I listened to in January. Oh, you can just see your history, but it is
Right,
one long list, and there's no dates, there's no anything, um,
right.
and you couldn't put a note like, "Did I enjoy this? Did I" not that I wouldn't wanna make some of them, like, public because sometimes, like, there's certain stories that I just don't enjoy.
Which is fair,
So
right? I've not every book isn't for every person. I mean, so
yeah, it's not a bad book. It's just
yeah,
wasn't the experience. It's just not the escape that I was looking for at the time.
right,
Um,
right.
yeah.
So
Anyways, thank you so much.
my pleasure. Thank you for
And
having me.
yeah, no, and we'll hope you'll come back in the future. This has been another episode of Fantasy Lore and More. Today we had Geneva Price and we talked about the Guildmaster's Daughter and a lot of other things. And I hope that you'll come back and listen to another episode next week. We'll have another fantasy author and another fantasy book. So make sure to follow, like, subscribe, do all the things so that you're alerted when the next episode drops. Thank you and keep reading.